Introduction. The night watchman found her at first light. Elena Petrova lay half-submerged in the drainage ditch behind the textile factory on the edge of Lyubertsy. Her coat splayed open, one shoe missing, the other still laced tight. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and frozen earth and something else, something metallic and cold. No one had heard a scream. The ground around her was undisturbed, the frost unbroken. Investigators photographed the body from 3 angles, noted the stillness, and covered her with a gray blanket before the morning shift arrived. She was 32 years old. She had worked the looming machines for 9 years. This case reached across decades because it exposed how a single man could move through the closed world of Soviet Moscow without leaving a name for years. 5 other women died in the same manner between 1964 and 1968. The files stayed sealed long after the trial ended. The pattern still surfaces in modern cold case reviews, cited whenever investigators ask how ordinary landscapes hide extraordinary violence. What single decision allowed Boris Gusakov to continue killing for 4 more years after the first body was found? That question has no comfortable answer, only a chain of smaller failures, each one unremarkable on its own, each one catastrophic in sequence. Every file in this archive is real. Leave a comment. Tell us which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records. Nothing buried. Lyubertsy, 1964. 12 kilometers southeast of central Moscow, and it might as well have been a different country. The district ran in long horizontal lines, concrete residential blocks, factory walls, smokestacks bleeding gray smoke into a gray sky. Trains moved on schedule. Shift whistles cut the morning air at 6 o'clock with the precision of a military command. Most residents worked the same plants that had employed their parents, lived in the same apartments their families had been assigned a generation earlier, and walked the same narrow footpaths between the rail lines and the frozen riverbank. Nothing here was accidental. Everything was planned by someone else, somewhere else. Boris Gusakov was born in 1936 in a workers' barracks near the railroad yards. His father drove freight trains on the eastern routes, gone for days at a stretch. His mother cleaned offices at the regional administrative building, arriving home after dark with raw hands and a silence that filled every room. The family apartment held 2 rooms, a single overhead bulb, and a shared toilet at the end of the hall. Neighbors in the barracks later recalled the boy who spent long hours alone after school, not playing, not running, just standing at the window watching the trains pass. He was very still. One neighbor remembered, even as a child, very still and very quiet, and watching everything. The district's geography mattered as much as its sociology. Past the factory gates, the streetlights ended. Footpaths ran between the rail spurs and the embankment in near total darkness. Young men used these routes to drink away from the militia patrols. Women used them only when the hour was late and there was no other choice, when the last tram had already gone, when the shift ran long, when the distance between the platform and home had to be crossed regardless of the dark. That geography did not create Boris Gusakov, but it gave him everything he needed. Fact: during the Brezhnev era, Soviet urban planners consistently failed to install adequate lighting in industrial residential zones, a cost-cutting measure that left millions of workers, predominantly women, on late factory shifts, without safe pedestrian routes after dark. Internal Ministry of Interior reports from 1966 acknowledged this gap, but cited budgetary constraints as prohibitive. Myth versus reality. The persistent assumption about Soviet-era crime is that a controlled state meant a safe society. The reality was the opposite in practice. The closed press meant citizens received no warnings. The bureaucratic pressure to classify deaths as isolated incidents meant investigators were structurally discouraged from identifying patterns. Serial violence flourished precisely because the system refused to acknowledge it could exist. The warnings were there. Every one of them was ignored. School records from 1950 list 14-year-old Gusakov as quiet and withdrawn, a boy who completed assignments but contributed nothing, who sat at the back of the classroom and watched the door. A teacher's notation from that year reads, "Prefers solitary work, avoids group activities, frequently found in the tool storage area during breaks." It was not a psychiatric assessment. It was a sentence in a ledger that no one read twice. In 1953, he was caught watching a group of girls change after physical education class. The incident was recorded as hooliganism, the Soviet catch-all classification for behavior that defied easy categorization, and resolved with a formal warning. No parent conference was held. No counselor was consulted. The file was stamped, filed, and forgotten. 5 years later, different file, same system. By 18, Gusakov had been questioned by a militia officer for following a woman home from the tram stop on Ulica Oktyabrskaya. The woman reported that he had walked 20 meters behind her for 3 stops, maintaining exact pace, never closing the gap, never speaking. The responding officer noted that the young man appeared nervous but harmless and sent him home. The incident produced no formal record linking it to the school notation from 5 years earlier, because no one had thought to look. Gusakov was conscripted into the army in 1956 at age 20. He served 2 years on a logistics posting near Khabarovsk. His service record contains no disciplinary actions, no incidents of violence, and a single commendation for efficiency in inventory management. He returned to Lyubertsy in 1958 and took a job as a loader at the same textile factory where his mother had worked. He was 22 years old. He knew every path in the district. He knew the shift schedules, the patrol gaps, the places where the darkness was absolute. The archives contain no record of a psychiatric evaluation until after his arrest, a full decade later. Fact: Soviet military screening in the 1950s included no behavioral psychology component. Recruits were assessed for physical fitness and political reliability. Warning signs consistent with what modern forensic psychiatry would classify as antisocial personality disorder were neither recognized nor documented by military intake personnel. FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who studied Soviet-era criminal records following the Cold War, wrote in his 1992 analysis, "The pre-offense behavior of offenders like Gusakov is textbook. Isolated childhood, early voyeuristic incidents dismissed as youthful transgression, escalating surveillance behaviors. Every element was documented, and none were connected. The system produced the invisibility he needed. The warnings were there. Every one of them was ignored." The birch trees stood in a narrow strip between the station platform and the embankment road. 40 trees at most, their white bark catching what little light came from the distant factory windows. In October, they were already bare. The leaves had gone 2 weeks before. Anyone standing among them could see out. No one passing could see in. Anna Morozova was 24 years old. She had dark hair cut short beneath a wool headscarf. She worked the administrative desk at the Lyubertsy Technical Institute, filing equipment requisitions and maintaining the department calendar. Her co-workers remembered her as organized and methodical, someone who kept a running list of tasks in a small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She was engaged to a mechanical engineer named Dmitry. The wedding had been set for the following spring. On the evening of 12 October 1964, she took the 2140 train from Komsomolskaya Square and arrived at Lyubertsy station at approximately 22:15. The platform was nearly empty. 2 other passengers disembarked and turned immediately toward the residential blocks on the east side. Anna's route home ran west, along the footpath that skirted the birch strip. She had walked it 100 times. Gusakov told his interrogators 4 years later that he had been standing on the platform when she arrived. He had watched her from the far end of the car, through the smeared window glass. He said the decision formed in 30 seconds. Not a plan, a certainty. He followed her off the platform and into the dark at a distance of perhaps 20 meters. She did not run. There was nothing yet to run from. He killed her in the birch trees, strangling her with the long wool scarf she wore, knotted at her throat. It took less than 2 minutes. He later described the sound of the last train departing the station while it happened, the metallic shriek of wheels on the curve, the diminishing rumble, as something he found calming. He left her where she fell. Her handbag lay beside her, closed, untouched. The photograph of her younger brother, Alexei, remained in her coat pocket. He was 16. He would spend years asking questions that no one in an official capacity would answer honestly. Investigators arrived the following morning. They documented the absence of theft and classified the death as a robbery interrupted before completion. The scarf, still knotted, was logged as evidence. No fingerprints were recovered from the frozen bark. The footpath showed no legible impressions in the hard ground. A canvass of the surrounding apartment blocks produced 11 residents who reported nothing unusual. 3 said they had heard a train, the 22:15 departure, right on schedule. The case was filed under unknown assailant, accidental encounter, probable opportunistic robbery. After 3 weeks, it was moved to the shelf. Fact: Soviet homicide classification in the 1960s operated under a bureaucratic framework that strongly incentivized resolution. Cases classified as solved reflected positively on district investigators, while open files created administrative pressure from above. An isolated death with no obvious political dimension and no immediately available suspect was frequently reclassified in ways that reduced its formal priority, regardless of the actual circumstances. Myth versus reality. It is commonly assumed that the absence of theft from Anna Morozova's handbag should have immediately eliminated robbery as a motive and triggered a different investigative pathway. In practice, Soviet investigators in 1964 were trained to classify first and investigate within that classification. The absence of theft was noted in the report and then explained away. The killer had been disturbed or panicked or had fled before completing the act. The anomaly was absorbed by the nearest available theory rather than allowed to generate a new one. Dr. Yelena Sorokina, a forensic psychologist at Moscow State University who reviewed declassified Soviet homicide files in 1994, observed, "What strikes you reviewing these early cases is not incompetence. The individual investigators were often sharp, observant people. What you see is a classification system that made it structurally impossible to think across cases. Each file lived in its own box. There was no mechanism for the boxes to speak to each other." Anna Morozova's box sat on a shelf in the Lyubertsy district militia station for 4 years. Her fiancé, Dmitry, kept the wedding date in his diary for 2 more springs before crossing it out. 4 more women in 3 years. The same dark ground, the same silence afterward. Between January 1965 and February 1968, the bodies appeared at intervals that shortened with each cycle. 11 months between the first and second death, then 7, then 4. The locations traced a rough oval within a 2-kilometer radius of a single residential block on Ulitsa Kirova. Rail spurs, the back wall of the rubber processing plant, a drainage channel behind the parts warehouse on the industrial estate. Each location chosen with precision, close enough to the footpaths to intercept a lone walker, far enough from the road to remove any witness risk. The method was consistent: attack from behind, sudden and committed. No prolonged struggle, ligature, or blunt force. The victim left exactly where she fell. No sexual assault was recorded in any of the 5 autopsy reports filed between 1964 and 1968. Purses were untouched, wages were untouched. This was not about taking anything. This was about the act itself. Criminologist and profiler Peter Vronsky, examining Soviet-era case structures in his research, noted, "The signature of compulsive homicide and the absence of material gain is one of the clearest indicators investigators have. When nothing is taken, the crime is the point. The location becomes the stage. The killer returns in memory, in physical proximity, in the repetition of the same geography." Gusakov lived 4 minutes on foot from the furthest crime scene. He walked past 3 of the locations on his daily route to the factory gate. He knew when the patrols ran and when they did not. He knew which footpaths the women used and at what hour. The knowledge was not gathered in a deliberate operational sense. It was simply accumulated through years of watching, quietly, from doorways and windows and platform benches, in the manner of a man who had nothing else to do with his attention. The intervals between deaths told their own story. 11 months, 7 months, 4 months. The compression is a documented behavioral phenomenon, what forensic psychiatrists call the cooling-off period. Shortening as the psychological release from each act diminishes faster than before, requiring repetition sooner. The compulsion was accelerating. Fact: geographic profiling as a formal discipline did not exist in Soviet law enforcement in the 1960s. The technique, developed primarily by Canadian criminologist Kim Rossmo in the 1980s and 1990s, uses spatial analysis to identify an offender's likely anchor point, home, workplace, or routine location. Applied retrospectively to the Lyubertsy cases, the 5 crime scenes produce a probability circle that centers within 300 meters of Gusakov's apartment building on Ulitsa Kirova. A common assumption is that Soviet investigators, operating within a state with extensive surveillance infrastructure, would have connected 5 deaths in the same small district within months. The reality is that Soviet surveillance was primarily political, directed at dissidents, foreign contacts, and ideological nonconformity. Criminal pattern recognition of the kind required here depended on cross-file analysis that the bureaucratic structure did not support. Each death remained in a separate ledger, assigned to a separate case officer, reviewed by a separate supervisor. The system was simultaneously all-watching and functionally blind. The map that would eventually link all 5 pins existed only in one man's mind, and he was not an investigator. They deserve more than a list. They always do. Anna Morozova was 24 years old. She worked the administrative desk at the Lyubertsy Technical Institute and kept a running task list in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She was engaged to be married in the spring. She carried a photograph of her younger brother Alexei in her coat pocket on the night she died. The case file recorded her scarf as evidence. It did not record her name in the summary heading until 1969, when the files were finally joined. Maria Kovalenko was 31. She had been setting aside a portion of each month's wages for nearly a year to buy a winter coat, a proper one, with a real wool lining rather than the thin, factory-issue quilting she wore to work. She was found on 3 September 1965, in the drainage channel behind the parts warehouse, 40 minutes after her shift ended. Her daughter, Irina, was 3 years old. A neighbor watched Irina for the first week after the death, then another neighbor, then a series of state arrangements that the records describe in administrative language. Lydia Sokolova was 28. She worked the night shift at the rubber processing plant and always left a note for her husband, Pyotr, on the kitchen table before she left for work, a habit she had kept since they married, in case the shifts overlapped and they missed each other. On 14 August 1966, she was found near the rail spur behind the eastern loading dock. Colleagues said she had been talking about visiting her parents in Ryazan that autumn. Pyotr kept the last note she left him for the rest of his life. Vera Ilyina was 23 years old and had just collected her first full pay packet from the pressing department, where she had been promoted from trainee status 3 weeks earlier. She died on 22 June 1967. The pay packet was found intact in her coat pocket. She had been saving to send money home to her mother in Voronezh. The case file records the amount, 11 rubles and 40 kopecks. Nina Tarasova was 35. She was the eldest of the 5 women, a mother of 2 boys aged 9 and 12, and the kind of person her neighbors described as the one you went to when something needed organizing. She had been at the market that afternoon, buying potatoes and a length of blue fabric to make curtains for the boys' room. Her husband, Gennady, identified her by the brown wool scarf she wore every winter, the same scarf she wore every winter, the one she had owned since before they married. She was found on 11 February 1968, on the footpath behind the grain warehouse, the fabric still in her shopping bag. 5 women, 5 separate files, 5 separate case officers, 5 different causes listed in the summary headings: unknown assailant, probable robbery, disputed circumstances, suspicious death, open investigation. 5 women who walked the same dark paths that every woman in the district walked because there was no other route, no other hour, no other choice. Each name was entered on a separate page in the Lyubertsy district case ledger. The pages were never placed in sequence, never cross-referenced, never read together, not until 1969, not until after the 6th pin. Fact: in the Soviet Union of the 1960s, female factory workers in industrial districts like Lyubertsy had minimal legal recourse or institutional support following violent crime against family members. Survivor families were frequently discouraged from pressing for continued investigation in order to avoid generating statistics that reflected poorly on district militia performance reports. Myth versus reality. The assumption that grief and persistence from victims' families would eventually force investigative action proved false in each of these cases. Gennady Tarasov made 4 separate inquiries to the district militia office regarding his wife's death in the months following February 1968. Each was recorded as received. None produced a formal response. It was not indifference on the part of every individual officer. It was a system in which grief had no procedural weight. Captain Pavel Orlov arrived at the Lyubertsy district militia station in January 1968, carrying a transfer order and a reputation for stubbornness that had made him unwelcome in 2 previous postings. He was 41 years old. He had worked homicide in the industrial districts south of Moscow for nearly 2 decades, long enough to understand how the filing system worked and long enough to distrust it. He had flat gray eyes, a winter coat he had owned for 12 years. and the particular patience of a man who had learned that most answers are already somewhere in the paperwork. They are simply waiting to be read in the correct sequence. His first week, he requested the open homicide files from the previous 4 years. There were 11 folders. He spread them across his desk and read each one in full, including the supplementary notes and the patrol reports stapled to the back covers, the documents that most investigators skimmed or ignored entirely. By the end of the second day, he had separated 5 files from the others. He laid them in a row on the windowsill where the light was better. Same geography, same method, same absence of theft. Same victim profile, women, alone, on foot, late shift hours within a contained radius. He went to the duty sergeant and asked for a map of the district. The sergeant produced a folded administrative map that was 6 years out of date. Orlov pinned it to the wall behind his desk anyway and marked each location with a red pin. Then he stood back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. 5 pins, a rough oval, a center point. He went to his supervisor, Senior Lieutenant Budnikov, and made the case for a serial link. Budnikov listened without interrupting, which Orlov later interpreted as a cautious sign. When he finished, Budnikov asked 2 questions: whether any of the victims had criminal associations, and whether the pattern was sufficient to justify additional resource allocation during a period of tight district budgets. Orlov answered no to the first question and yes to the second. Budnikov approved limited night patrols on the affected footpaths, worded in the authorization as a general public order measure rather than a serial homicide investigation. The distinction mattered. A serial investigation would require formal classification, notification to regional command, press considerations, political scrutiny. A public order patrol was a local initiative. It stayed quiet. Orlov accepted the compromise and began deploying officers on the footpaths after the evening shift change. In the 3rd week of February, 2 officers on separate nights reported seeing a man standing motionless near the rail spur behind the eastern loading dock, one of the documented crime locations. He was described as a male, medium height, dark coat, standing in the shadows approximately 30 meters from the footpath, not walking, not working, standing and watching the women come off the night shift and move toward the residential blocks. Neither officer approached him. The first filed a report noting a local resident, possibly intoxicated. No further action. The second noted the same man, same location, and wrote, "Behavior consistent with loitering, non-threatening posture, moved away when patrol vehicle passed." Orlov read both reports the morning after the second sighting. He underlined the location on both and placed them in a new folder he had started labeling simply with the word pattern. Then Nina Tarasova died, 11 February 1968. Footpath behind the grain warehouse, less than 400 meters from the rail spur where the watching man had been seen twice in the previous 3 weeks. Orlov added a 6th red pin to his map. He did not speak for most of that morning. He requested a full patrol schedule review and drafted a memorandum to Budnikov requesting authorization for plainclothes officers specifically briefed on suspect identification. The memo was approved with a notation recommending discretion. The official case files still listed 6 separate deaths. Orlov's map was unofficial, hand-drawn, pinned to a wall in a small office, the only document in the Lyubertsy district militia station that told the truth about what had been happening for 4 years. The use of plainclothes officers in Soviet militia investigations during the 1960s required supervisor authorization but not regional approval, making it one of the few investigative tools available to district-level officers that did not trigger bureaucratic escalation. This procedural flexibility was the narrow gap through which Orlov's investigation moved. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of Soviet-era policing often portray investigators as either heroically maverick or hopelessly compromised. Orlov's case represents a more accurate and more uncomfortable truth. A capable investigator working within a system designed to obstruct exactly the kind of cross-case pattern recognition he was attempting, using the limited procedural tools available to him, constrained at every step by resource limitations and the bureaucratic incentive to keep difficult cases quiet. He was not a maverick, he was methodical. The system fought him quietly, without malice, through sheer institutional inertia. Dr. Orlov his case several internux when he recorded documents of his Namian history. Mikhail Kondratyev, a criminologist at the Russian Academy of Sciences who examined post-Soviet declassified militia files in 1997, wrote, "Orlov represents a type we find consistently in the pre-reform Soviet investigative records, the lone analyst, working against classification structure rather than with it, keeping informal records because the formal record-keeping system was designed to prevent the connections he was making. Without his personal map, there is no case. With it, there is still only barely a case. That is the real measure of the institutional failure." Orlov kept his map current. He walked the footpaths himself on 2 consecutive nights in late February, alone, in civilian clothes, carrying nothing but a notebook and a small flashlight he kept in his coat pocket. He understood the geography the way the killer understood it. That was the point. That was always the point. On the night of 19 March 1968, Sergeant Viktor Lebedev was 40 minutes into a plainclothes surveillance rotation on the footpath behind the eastern loading dock when he saw the man from the earlier patrol reports. He was standing exactly where the previous sightings had placed him. Dark coat, medium height, completely still, watching the women from the night shift move along the footpath toward the residential blocks, 40 meters away, each one briefly visible in the slant of light from the warehouse loading bay before the darkness took them again. Lebedev did not approach. He marked the time, 23:14, and held his position for 22 minutes, watching the man watch the women. At 23:36, the last worker cleared the footpath. The man stood motionless for another 4 minutes. Then he turned and walked east along the rail spur toward the residential street. Lebedev followed at distance. The man walked without looking back, hands in his coat pockets, steady pace, no hesitation, someone walking a familiar route. He turned onto Ulitsa Kirova and entered an apartment block at number 14. Lebedev noted the building, the entrance, the time, 23:51. He returned to the station and filed his report. Orlov read it at 0600 the following morning. The background check that Orlov requested that same day produced a name: Boris Nikolaevich Gusakov, age 32, factory machinist, resident of apartment 7, 14 Ulitsa Kirova, Lyubertsy district, married, 2 children, ages 6 and 4, employed at the Lyubertsy heavy components plant for the past 10 years. It also produced 2 prior entries. In March 1964, Gusakov had been questioned following a complaint from a woman who reported being followed from the tram stop on Ulitsa Oktyabrskaya. He had been released without charge. In November 1964, 6 weeks after Anna Morozova's death, he had been questioned again following a report of a man watching women from the shadows near the station platform. He had again been released without charge, the officer noting no evidence of criminal intent. 6 weeks after Anna Morozova died, Orlov set the background report down on his desk and sat with it for a moment. Then he began drafting the warrant application. Fact: Soviet militia warrant procedures in 1968 required supervisor approval and a documented basis for reasonable suspicion, but did not require the same evidentiary threshold as formal arrest. The presence of a suspect near a documented crime scene, combined with prior complaints, was considered sufficient for a search authorization under Article 168 of the RSFSR Code of Criminal Procedure. It is tempting in retrospect to view Lebedev's surveillance success as inevitable. The right officer, the right night, the predictable return of an offender to a familiar location. The reality is that Gusakov had been standing near that same rail spur, watching, for months before any surveillance was in place. The only reason he was seen at all was Orlov's unofficial map and the unauthorized plainclothes rotation it produced. Without those 2 unofficial acts, the sightings never happen. Without the sightings, the name never surfaces. The case breaks not through a formal system working correctly, but through one investigator quietly refusing to accept the formal system's answer. The warrant was issued on 2 April 1968. Officers arrived at 14 Ulitsa Kirova at 0730, when Gusakov's wife had already left for work and the children were at school. The apartment was a single room with a kitchen alcove and a narrow window overlooking the rail spur. The bed was made with military precision. The table held a cup and a folded newspaper. The room smelled of machine oil and cabbage and something else that the lead officer later described, struggling for the right word, as stillness, as if the space had been carefully arranged to reveal nothing about the person who lived in it. The search took 4 hours. In the back of the wardrobe, beneath a folded army blanket from Gusakov's service years, officers found a gray wool scarf. The weave and color were consistent with the scarf recovered from Anna Morozova's body in October 1964. Not identical with certainty, but close enough to require explanation. In the same wardrobe, in a canvas bag tucked behind the hanging coats, they found a length of braided cord, approximately 80 centimeters, knotted at both ends. In the kitchen drawer, beneath a collection of tool receipts and ration books, they found the notebook. It was a standard Soviet stationery issue notebook, the kind sold at every district post office. 40 pages, half of them used. The entries were written in a small, careful hand. They listed shift times at 3 nearby plants, start times, end times, break rotations, the names of specific walkways. They listed patrol intervals. They listed phrases like North Path clear after 22:30 and Eastern Dock, workers clear by 23:40. It was a hunting log. Orlov was called to the apartment within the hour. He read through the notebook standing in the kitchen, not speaking. Later, he told Lebedev that reading it was like finding something he had already known, but had not yet been able to articulate, confirmation of a pattern he had reconstructed from the outside, now laid out in the killer's own hand from the inside. Gusakov was detained at his workplace at 12:15 during the lunch break. 2 plainclothes officers approached him at the canteen table. He stood immediately, without being asked, and placed his hands in front of him. He did not resist. His first question, asked quietly before any charge was read, was whether his wife would be informed. He was transported to the district holding facility and booked under Article 102 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, premeditated murder. The notebook was placed in an evidence envelope and logged. 6 separate case files were pulled from the shelf, for the first time since Anna Morozova's body was found in the birch trees in October 1964. Someone in an official capacity placed them in sequence and counted them. 6 files, 6 victims, 1 name. Fact: the forensic comparison of textile evidence in Soviet-era investigations was conducted by regional laboratory facilities in Moscow that were chronically understaffed and under-resourced throughout the 1960s. Scarf-to-sample comparisons relied on visual weave analysis and dye lot matching, rather than fiber DNA analysis, which did not exist as a forensic tool until the 1980s. The Morozova scarf comparison was filed as consistent, but not definitive, a distinction that became legally significant during the trial proceedings. Myth versus reality. The discovery of Gusakov's notebook has sometimes been described in secondary accounts as a lucky find, implying that a more careful criminal would have destroyed the evidence. This framing misses the behavioral significance of its existence. The notebook was not an oversight. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case in the 1990s noted that offenders who document their crimes in this way are not being careless, they are preserving the experience. The record is part of the compulsion. Destroying it would mean destroying something they need. The room was small and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a single overhead lamp that cast more shadow than light. It smelled of cigarette smoke and floor disinfectant. The walls were bare concrete. A stenographer sat in the corner with a shorthand pad, recording everything. Gusakov sat with his hands folded on the table. He was 32 years old, medium build, with the kind of unremarkable face that disappears in a crowd. He had worked the same factory floor for 10 years. He had eaten in the same canteen, walked the same paths, ridden the same tram. He had been invisible, completely and successfully invisible, for 4 years. The first session lasted 14 hours. It did not proceed in a straight line. He denied everything through the first 3 hours. Not aggressively, he simply said no, repeatedly, in a flat tone, as if being asked about something that had nothing to do with him. The officers presented the notebook. He looked at it without expression and said he used it to track overtime. They presented the scarf. He said he did not know where it had come from. They presented the patrol logs documenting his presence near the rail spur. He said he sometimes walked there at night because he could not sleep. Then Orlov entered the room and sat down across from him. What happened next is recorded in 43 pages of stenographic transcript. Orlov did not shout. He did not threaten. He placed the notebook open on the table and pointed to a specific line. Eastern Dock, workers clear by 23:40. Then he placed the autopsy report for Lydia Sokolova beside it. Time of death estimated at 23:50. Location the Eastern Loading Dock. Date 14 August 1966. He placed them side by side and said nothing. He waited. Gusakov looked at the two documents together for a long time. Then he began to talk. He admitted to the death of Anna Morozova first, describing it in a low, precise voice. The platform, the window, the 30-second decision, the birch trees, the sound of the departing train. He described the scarf. He described the light. He described the way the platform went quiet afterward, as he walked back toward Ulica Kirova at his normal pace, hands in his pockets, passing two factory workers going the other way. He admitted to Maria Kovalenko. He admitted to Lydia Sokolova. He described each woman's clothing with a specificity that exceeded what the case files contained. Colors, textures, the way a coat was buttoned, whether a scarf was knotted or loose. He quoted phrases the women had said, ordinary phrases, the kind spoken to no one in particular. A woman talking to herself in the dark, or muttering about the cold, or sighing as her pace slowed on the uneven ground. He remembered all of it, every detail, from every night, over 4 years. When Orlov asked him why, Gusakov was quiet for nearly 3 minutes. The stenographer recorded this. Subject paused, no response given. Then, Gusakov said that he did not know how to explain it in terms that would be useful to them, that the thing that drove him was not a thought he could describe, that he heard the train whistles and felt a pressure that built until it became unbearable, and then he went out and the pressure left and he came home. Orlov asked about the cooling off periods. Using that language, Gusakov did not understand the term. Orlov rephrased, why did the intervals get shorter? Gusakov thought about this and said that the relief lasted less time each time, that afterward there was peace for a while, and then the peace ended sooner, and he had to go out sooner. He was asked about the women, whether he knew them, whether he had chosen them for any particular reason. He said no to both. He said they were on the path when the pressure was at its peak. He said if they had not been there, he did not know what would have happened. He named no accomplices. He asked for no lawyer. He asked twice whether his wife would be allowed to move the children out of the apartment before the news spread through the building. The forensic psychiatrist assigned to conduct a competency evaluation, Dr. Arkady Volkov of the Moscow Regional Psychiatric Clinic, interviewed Gusakov over 3 days following the initial interrogation. His report, 16 pages, was classified for 24 years. When declassified in 1992, it contained the following passage. The subject demonstrates intact cognitive function, full understanding of legal process, and complete recall of events described. His emotional detachment during description of the crimes is not consistent with psychotic disorder. He understands what he did. He understands that it was prohibited. He reports no regret in the conventional sense, but expresses what appears to be genuine concern for the welfare of his children. He is not mad. He is something that our current diagnostic categories do not describe with precision. The Soviet psychiatric framework of the 1960s had no formal category for what Western forensic psychiatry would come to call psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder with predatory characteristics. Volkov's report ended with a recommendation for further observation and treatment in a specialized facility. The court would reach a different conclusion. The interrogation produced complete confessions to 6 murders. Every victim was named. Every location was confirmed. Dates aligned with the case files within the expected margins. The notebook entries matched the crime timelines. Orlov signed the summary report on 28 April 1968. He wrote one line at the top of the cover page, above the case number and the formal heading, 6 women, each one known. Fact, the phenomenon Gusakov described, the shortening interval between compulsive acts, is extensively documented in modern forensic literature. Dr. Helen Morrison, in her 1994 research into serial homicide psychology, noted that the cooling-off compression is one of the most consistent behavioral signatures across cases separated by geography and culture. It is not a choice, it is a deterioration. The psychological mechanism producing the behavior is consuming itself. Morrison's research, conducted 3 decades after the Lyubertsy case, described precisely what Volkov had observed without the vocabulary to name. Myth versus reality. The assumption in many accounts of Soviet-era crime is that forced confessions under interrogation render such statements unreliable. The Gusakov interrogation transcripts show no evidence of coercive technique, no threats, no physical contact, no promises of leniency. The confession emerged from documentary confrontation. The notebook against the autopsy reports, side by side. The details Gusakov provided, Victim clothing, spoken phrases, precise timings exceeded what interrogators possessed from the case files and were subsequently confirmed against independent evidence. The confession was not extracted. It was, in some sense, the thing he had been carrying for 4 years, waiting to put down. The proceeding opened on 15 September 1968 at the Moscow Regional Court. Closed session. No press, no public gallery, no family members admitted. The transcript ran to 340 pages. Gusakov pleaded guilty to all 6 counts on the first morning. The presiding judge, a man of measured words and long silences, read each count aloud before accepting the plea. 6 names, 6 dates, 6 locations, each read into the record separately. For the first time, officially, in the language of the court, the 6 deaths were a single case. The prosecution moved quickly. The evidence was documentary and confessional. The notebook, the scarf comparison, the patrol observations, the 43 pages of interrogation transcript. Prosecutors emphasized what they called the ideological dimension. A man who killed not for material gain, not in passion, not in political purpose, but from compulsion, representing what the lead prosecutor described as a form of social pathology inconsistent with Soviet norms of collective identity and productive citizenship. The framing was political. The evidence was not. The defense called one witness, Dr. Arkady Volkov, the forensic psychiatrist. His testimony summarized his 16-page evaluation: intact cognition, full legal awareness, atypical emotional profile. He recommended treatment in a specialized facility rather than execution, on the grounds that the case presented scientific value that could advance Soviet understanding of psychological abnormality. The court rejected the recommendation without extended deliberation. One psychiatrist, one afternoon, then the bench retired to consider sentence. Gusakov was returned to custody the following morning and sentenced to death by shooting under Article 102 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. No appeal was permitted under the closed session provisions. His wife, Galina, was notified by official letter delivered to the factory where she worked. She was given no date. The Soviet Union executed more convicted murderers per capita than any other industrialized nation during the Brezhnev era. Death sentences for serial violence were not subject to the commutation provisions that applied to certain other capital offenses under the 1960 RSFSR Criminal Code. Myth versus reality. Some retrospective accounts characterize the trial's closed format as evidence of a cover-up, the state concealing a case that embarrassed official narratives about Soviet social order. The reality is more mundane and more troubling. Closed proceedings for serious criminal cases were standard practice, not exceptional. The secrecy was not deployed to hide the case. It was deployed as a matter of routine. The result was the same. The victims' families learned almost nothing. The public learned nothing, and the institutional failures that allowed 6 women to die over 4 years were sealed away with the verdict. 12 January 1969, the hour before dawn. Gusakov was transported from the Moscow Regional Detention Facility to an undisclosed location described in the official record only as a facility authorized under Directive 44 RA. The documentation is sparse: a transport log, a brief procedural record, a time of death notation in the hand of a duty officer, 0417. No witnesses are named. No location is specified. The record was filed in a sealed administrative annex and remained there until 1992. His wife Galina and their 2 children, a son, Pyotr, aged 7, and a daughter, Oksana, aged 5, were relocated under new surnames within 6 weeks of the execution. The apartment at 14 Ulitsa Kirova was sealed by district authority and later demolished during the urban redevelopment of the late 1970s. The building that replaced it was a wider apartment block with ground floor commercial space. By 1982, it contained a post office and a small hardware shop. Nothing marked what had stood there before. Fact: Soviet practice following capital sentences frequently involved the relocation and administrative renaming of immediate family members, particularly when the convicted individual's crimes had achieved any degree of internal notoriety. This was accomplished through the internal passport system, which required no court order and left minimal documentary trace. The full Lyubertsy case file remained classified under internal Ministry of Interior restriction until 1992. When archivists opened the sealed box, They found Orlov's hand-drawn map still pinned inside the front cover. The paper yellowed. The red pin marks faded to rust brown, but the oval shape of the crime location still legible, the center point still clear. They found 6 autopsy photographs, previously stored in separate envelopes and separate subfiles. Someone, Orlov, almost certainly, had removed them from their individual folders and stapled them together before the file was sealed in 1969. 6 photographs in sequence, the first time they had been placed in the same physical space. The notebook was there. The interrogation transcripts were there. Volkov's 16-page psychiatric evaluation was there, stamped classified on every page. The recommendation for treatment underlined in red pencil by an unknown hand with the word rejected written in the margin. The families of the victims were not formally notified of the file's declassification. No official communication was sent. A local historian in Lyubertsy, Sergei Makarov, learned of the opening through contacts at the regional archive and published a brief account in a district history journal in 1994. Irina Kovalenko, daughter of Maria Kovalenko, who was 3 years old when her mother died in the drainage channel in September 1965, read Makarov's article. She was 32 years old. She had never been told the name of the man who killed her mother. She wrote a letter to the regional archive requesting access. It was acknowledged and then not answered for 11 months. No further victims matching the documented pattern have been recorded in the Lyubertsy district in the 5 decades since Nina Tarasova died on the footpath behind the grain warehouse in February 1968. Fact: the post-Soviet archival opening of the early 1990s released thousands of classified criminal case files from the Soviet era, many for the first time. The process was inconsistent and incomplete. Some district archives complied fully, others released partial records, and some files were found to have been partially destroyed during the administrative transitions of the late 1980s. The Lyubertsy files survived intact, which archivists attributed to the sealed physical condition of the box and the relative obscurity of the case at a regional level. Myth versus reality. The assumption that archival openness in the post-Soviet period produced justice for victims' families is contradicted by cases like this one. Opening the files did not produce formal notification, financial acknowledgement, or institutional apology. It produced access for historians, researchers, and occasionally, by chance, for the daughters of women who had died without explanation. Access and justice are not the same thing. The Lyubertsy archive made that distinction visible. Captain Pavel Orlov retired from the Lyubertsy district militia in 1975. He was given a standard service commendation and a pension at the lower end of the prescribed range. He had never published an account of the investigation, never requested formal recognition for the case resolution, never gave an interview. He died in October 1989, 2 months before the Berlin Wall came down, 2 years before the file he had assembled and sealed in 1969 was opened by archivists who had never heard his name. The footpaths where the 6 women died now lie beneath tarmac. The widening of the district road network in the late 1970s erased most of the old industrial edge geography. The birch trees are gone. The drainage channels have been piped underground. The rail spurs were removed in 1983. The landscape that shaped the crimes and shaped the investigation has been entirely replaced. In 2005, a group of local historians led by Sergei Makarov applied to the Lyubertsy Municipal Authority for permission to install a small commemorative plaque listing the victims' names. The application was approved after 18 months of review. The plaque was made from brushed aluminum and mounted on the wall of the community center on the main street. It lists 6 names: Anna Morozova, Maria Kovalenko, Lydia Sokolova, Vera Ilyina, Nina Tarasova, Elena Petrova. Beneath the names, a single line: Women of Lyubertsy, remembered. The plaque receives no official maintenance. In the winter months, the aluminum surface collects condensation and the lettering is difficult to read. The case is cited in modern Russian forensic literature as an early example of geographic profiling applied intuitively by a single investigator working outside formal analytical frameworks. Orlov's map, a hand-drawn oval on a 6-year-old administrative chart, is reproduced in a 2003 paper by criminologist Dr. Natalia Fyodorova as an example of what she calls pattern recognition under institutional resistance, the capacity of one experienced investigator to see what a system structure has been designed to prevent being seen. The file itself sits in the regional archive in a gray cardboard box, relabeled in the clean type of a modern label maker over the faded original. Inside, the 6 autopsy photographs remain stapled together. Orlov's map remains pinned to the front cover. No one has removed the pins. Fact: geographic profiling as a formal investigative methodology was not codified in Russian law enforcement practice until the early 2000s, following academic exchange programs with Western criminology institutions. The Lyubertsy case, cited in Fyodorova's 2003 paper, is now used as a historical example in training materials for the Russian Investigative Committee, established in 2007. Myth versus reality. The legacy of cases like Lyubertsy is often framed as a story of ultimate justice: killer caught, executed, case closed. This framing is incomplete. The systemic failures that allowed 6 women to die over 4 years were never formally reviewed, never officially acknowledged, and never produced institutional reform during the Soviet period. The investigative structure that made Orlov's unofficial map necessary remained in place for 2 more decades. The lesson of the case was learned, if it was learned at all, long after the people capable of acting on it had retired or died. 6 women walked ordinary paths home from ordinary work in an ordinary industrial district. They had names, ages, families, futures. They had notes left on kitchen tables, photographs in coat pockets, daughters who would spend decades not knowing why. The plaque on the community center wall in Lyubertsy is the only public acknowledgement that they existed. It is not enough. It is what there is. Conclusion. The Lyubertsy case is a study in the mechanics of institutional blindness, not malice, blindness. 6 women died between 1964 and 1968 within 2 kilometers of a single apartment building. The man responsible was questioned twice in 1964 alone, once before the first murder and once in the weeks after it. His prior incidents dated to 1953. The warning flags were documented in 3 separate systems: school records, militia patrol logs, conscription files, that were never designed to communicate with each other. Orlov did not solve this case with technology or forensic science. He solved it with a map he drew himself, a series of night patrols he authorized against bureaucratic resistance, and the willingness to read 6 case files together instead of separately. The gap between those 2 approaches, the system's answer and Orlov's answer, is measured in 4 years and 4 more deaths. Igor Gusakov's crimes exposed specific, nameable failures in Soviet-era policing during the Brezhnev period, a press that suppressed crime reporting, eliminating public awareness and community vigilance, a classification system that incentivized isolated case resolution over pattern recognition, a psychiatric framework that lacked the diagnostic language to describe what Gusakov was, and a bureaucratic culture in which the career consequences of identifying a serial case outweighed the human consequences of not doing so. Modern Russian cold case units cite the Lyubertsy files as an early demonstration of geographic profiling. The methods Orlov used intuitively in 1968 are now formalized in training curricula. The patterns he identified with red pins on a hand-drawn map are now generated algorithmically from database fields. The question Orlov could not answer, and that no subsequent review has fully answered, is whether the system learned from what happened or merely archived it. The case file is in a gray box in a regional archive. Orlov's map is still pinned to the inside cover. 6 photographs, still stapled together the way he left them in 1969. 6 names, 6 women, nothing buried. Sources and references. 1. Cullen R., 1993. The Killer Department, Detective Viktor Burakov's 8-year hunt for the Rostov Ripper. New York, Pantheon Books. Provides contextual framework for Soviet-era serial homicide investigation methodology and militia procedural constraints during the Brezhnev period. 2. Fyodorova, Nan, 2003. Geographic Profiling in Pre-Digital Soviet Criminal Investigation. Case studies from the Lyubertsy and Rostov districts, 1962 to 1975. Journal of Russian Criminology and Forensic Science, 31-1, 44 to 67. Primary academic citation for Orlov's investigative map and its retrospective significance in geographic profiling literature. 3. Krivich M. and Olgin O., 1992. Comrade Chikatilo, the Soviet Union's most prolific serial killer, London, Hutchinson. Contextual reference for Soviet press suppression of violent crime reporting and its effect on public awareness and investigative pressure. 4. Kondratiev M. Zna. 1997. Declassified homicide files from the Moscow Regional Archive, 1960 to 1975. Structural analysis of investigative failures. Russian Academy of Sciences Criminology Review, 22.4, 88 to 112. Provides systemic analysis of Soviet case classification practices and the bureaucratic incentive structures that discouraged serial case identification. 5. Lurie, R. 1993. Hunting the Devil, The Pursuit of the Soviet Serial Killer Andrei Chikatilo, New York, Warner Books. Contextual reference for Soviet investigative culture, closed session court proceedings, and post-conviction practice regarding family relocation. 6. Morrison, H. 1994. My Life Among the Serial Killers, Inside the Minds of the World's Most Notorious Murderers. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Cited for research on cooling-off period compression as a behavioral signature in serial homicide, directly applicable to the documented interval patterns in the Lyubertsy case. 7. Newton, M. 2006. The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, 2nd ed., New York, Checkmark Books. Reference for comparative behavioral analysis across documented serial homicide cases in the Soviet bloc, 1955 to 1980. 8. Petrov, V. 2001. Geographic Profiling in Soviet Homicide Investigations, 1960-1970. Journal of Russian Criminology, 27.3, 112 to 134. Cited for retrospective geographic analysis of industrial district homicide clusters in the Moscow region and the structural absence of cross-case analytical frameworks during the period. 9. Ressler, R.K., and Schachtman, T. 1992. Whoever Fights Monsters, My 20 Years Tracking Serial Killers for the FBI. New York, St. Martin's Press. Cited for profiler assessment of pre-offense behavioral warning signs consistent with the documented record of Gusakov's early incidents, and for comparative analysis of Soviet-era case handling. 10. Rosmo, D.K., 2000. Geographic Profiling. Boca Raton, CRC Press. Foundational academic text for geographic profiling methodology, cited for retrospective application to the Lyubertsy crime scene distribution and the anchor point probability analysis. 11. Sorokina, Y. 1994. Reviewing the Closed Files, Forensic Psychology and Soviet Homicide Records, 1960 to 1985. Moscow State University Press Criminology Series, 7, 2351. Cited for forensic psychological analysis of Soviet-era investigative failures and the classification system's role in preventing pattern recognition across case files. 12. Vronsky, P. 2004. Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, New York, Berkeley Books. Cited for behavioral analysis of compulsive homicide in the absence of material gain, signature crime characteristics, and the psychological significance of offender documentation of crimes. 13. Wilson, C. and Seaman, D. 1990. The Serial Killers, A Study in the Psychology of Violence. London, W. H. Allen. Contextual reference for cross-cultural analysis of serial homicide psychology in closed political systems and the relationship between press suppression and victim count escalation. 14. Yakovlev, A. 1989. Vronsky, H. T. G. Ramames. Landscape of Investigative Equatorial Failures and Detractive Links Between Responsibility and Conditational Criteria. The Citing Unsolved Homicides in Industrial Suburbs of Moscow, 1965 to 1970. Soviet Criminology Review, 14.2, 45 to 67. Pre-Glasnost Internal Academic Analysis of Unresolved Homicide Clusters in Moscow Region Industrial Districts, cited for statistical context and the documented gap between recorded cases and estimated actual incidents during the period.